On today's podcast episode of the Fourth and Long podcast, I will be going over my ACC preview for the 2024 college football season with my thoughts and predictions for the ACC with record predictions and standings. And let's get right into it. We are first going to do the record predictions for all the ACC teams, which also means we start with the non-bowl teams. And the first non-bowl team in the ACC this year, I believe, is going to be Stanford. So why don't we get to Stanford schedule this year? So Stanford opens the year at home against TCU. And my thoughts on Stanford this year is I think they're going to struggle in year one in the ACC this year. And it's going to take them a couple years to get used to being in a new conference. As you all remember, for the longest time, they were in the Pac-12. And they had some good years under David Shaw, but now they've got a different style of coach in there. And Troy Taylor, I believe that is the Stanford head coach. And I don't see where Stanford can win. I'm going to say more than 3 games this year, and let's go over their schedule now. So Stanford, like I said, they open the year at home against TCU. I think they will lose to TCU, so they're 0-1. They will get their first one against Cal Poly. So they're 1-1. Then they go to Syracuse. That's going to be a loss, so they're 1-2. Then they go to Clemson. I think they lose to Clemson. Then they come home and play Virginia Tech. Now, normally, I would put this as a win for Stanford, but I think they lose. So their only win so far is against Cal Poly. And they've lost to TCU, Syracuse, Clemson, Virginia Tech. So they're 1-4. Then they go to Notre Dame. That is a rivalry. That is a game they play every season. And I know technically it is not an ACC game, but I still think they lose. So they're 1-5. Then they play SMU at home. I think they're going to be 1-6 after losing to SMU. Then they lose. Then their second one of the year comes against Wake Forest. So they're 2-6. But then they go right back to losing. They lose to NC State, 2-7. Lose to Louisville, 2-8. Lose to Cal, 2-9. And lose to San Jose State, 2-10. So Stanford's 2024 record for me, in my opinion, is going to be 2-10. Next team is Pittsburgh. And for Pitt, I think they're going to have a decent year, but they have a new quarterback. And I don't know how that's going to work this year with Eli Holstein because he didn't play at all last year at Alabama. But let's take a look at their schedule. So week 1, they start at home against Kent State. I think that's an easy win, so they're 1-0. Then they play Cincinnati at Cincinnati. I think that's going to be a loss, so they're 1-1. Then they come home and play West Virginia. They're going to be 2-1. 1-2 as they lose to West Virginia. 2-2 after they beat Youngstown State. Then they get North Carolina. I think that's going to be a loss. So they're 2-3. They beat Cal 3-3. Lose to Syracuse 3-4. Lose to SMU 3-5. Beat Virginia 4-5. Lose to Clemson 4-6. Lose to Louisville 4-7. And lose to Boston College 4-8. So I think Pitt in 2024 goes 4-8. And I don't think Pat Narduzzi gets fired. The next team that I do not think makes a bowl game is Virginia. And Virginia's schedule. So my thoughts on Virginia this year is I think they're going to be just as bad as they were last year, maybe even worse, because they have some promise at quarterback, but I don't see them winning more than maybe 3 games. And let's take a look at their schedule. They start the year at home against Richmond. I think they beat Richmond, so they're 1-0. Then they play Wake Forest. I think they lose to Wake Forest, so they're 1-1. Then they play Maryland at home. That's also going to be a loss, so they're 1-2. Then they get a tough road game at Coastal Carolina. They are going to lose that, so they're 1-3. Then they play Boston College the next week. So they're 1-3. I think they lose to Boston College, so they're 1-4. And I think it's after that game where Tony Elliott gets fired. Yes. Sorry about that. They lose to Louisville 1-5. Lose to Clemson 1-6. Lose to North Carolina 1-7. Lose to Pitt 1-8. Lose to Notre Dame 1-9. Beat SMU 2-9, and lose to Virginia Tech 2-10. So I think Virginia also goes 2-10. And the last non-bowl team we have for 2024 for the ACC is Wake Forest. So Wake Forest, I see them missing a bowl game this year, and this being like a retooling year for Wake Forest and the ACC. Let's take a look at their schedule. And so they have a cupcake game week 1. Week 1, they play North Carolina A&T. I think they're going to win that game, so they're 1-0. They beat Virginia, so they're 2-0. Then they play Ole Miss. That's going to be a loss, so they're 2-1. Then they play Louisiana. They're going to be 3-1 after beating Louisiana. Then they play at NC State. They're going to lose to NC State 3-2. They lose to Clemson 3-3. Beat UConn 4-3. Beat Stanford 5-3. Lose to Cal 5-4. Lose to North Carolina 5-5. Lose to Miami 5-6. And lose to Duke 5-7. So I think Wake Forest goes 5-7 in 2024. Now we get to my sleepers for the ACC in 2024. And my first sleeper team is Boston College. And they start the year Monday, September 2nd at Florida State. That is going to be a loss. So they're 0-1. And my thoughts on Boston College, I think they're going to be a team that surprises a lot of people this year with Bill O'Brien as their head coach. They did bring back Thomas Castellanos. And they have a few other guys on offense that are going to be really good. But back to their schedule. Here's their prediction on their record for me. So they're 0-1 to start the season. Then they play Duquesne. They're going to beat Duquesne. Then they play at Missouri. That's going to be a loss. So they're 1-2. They lose to Michigan State 1-3. Beat Western Kentucky 2-3. Beat Virginia 2-4. 3-4. Lose to Virginia Tech. Wait, no. So they lose to Florida State 0-1. Beat Duquesne 1-1. Lose to Missouri 1-2. Lose to Michigan State 1-3. Beat Western Kentucky 2-3. Beat Virginia 3-3. Lose to Virginia Tech 3-4. Now, I want to say they're going to beat Louisville, but I could be wrong. But I do think they end up beating Louisville. So they're now 4-4 on the season. Then they go to Syracuse comes to play them. I think they beat Syracuse. So they're 5-4. Then they go to SMU and lose to SMU, so they're 5-5. Then they play North Carolina at home. That's going to be a loss. So they're 5-6, and they beat Pitt to go to 6-6. So Boston College's 2024 record for me is 6-6. My next sleeper team in the ACC is Syracuse. And you might hear me talk about their coach later on at the end of the episode. But I like what Syracuse did in the portal this year, getting a bunch of guys. And let's take a look at their schedule. So week 1, they play at home against Ohio. That's going to be a win. So they're 1-0. They play Georgia Tech. That's a coin flip for me. I think they beat Georgia Tech, though. So they're 2-0. Then they play Stanford 3-0. 4-0 after they beat Holy Cross. I think they get a chance to start 5-0 because they're going to beat UNLV. Then they get back into conference play, and they play at North Carolina State. That's going to be their first loss of the year, so they're 5-1. They beat Pitt 6-1. Lose to Virginia Tech 6-2. Lose to Boston College 6-3. Beat Cal 7-4. Beat UConn 8-4, and lose to Miami 8-5. So Syracuse's 2024 record for me is 8-5. My next sleeper team in the ACC in 2024 is North Carolina. I don't know why I said it like that. And let me give you my thoughts on North Carolina real quick. I think they're going to be good, but how good can they be without Drake May, who is now on the New England Patriots? I apologize for that. So week 1, they start the season at Minnesota. I think that's going to be a win, so they're 1-0. Then they play Charlotte. They're going to be 2-0. Then they play North Carolina Central. That's a win, so they're 3-0. Now, I'm circling this game against James Madison. To me, I'm not going to say it's a coin toss, but I think they might lose to James Madison. But but they don't. So they are 4-0. Going into ACC play, they play at Duke. They're going to beat Duke 5-0. Beat Pitt 6-0. They take their first loss at home against Georgia Tech. So they are now 6-1. They beat Virginia 7-1. Lose to Florida State 7-2. Beat Wake Forest 8-2. Lose to Boston College 8-3. And lose to North Carolina State 8-4. So North Carolina's record for me in 2024 will be 8-4. My next and final sleeper team in the ACC in 2024 is Duke. Now, I know I questioned the hire of Manny Diaz when it first happened, but I actually like the hire of Manny Diaz for Duke. And I like bringing in Malik Murphy. And now why don't we take a look at their 2024 schedule? They start the year at home against Elon. I think they're going to win that game. They should. So they're 1-0. They play at Northwestern the next week. They're going to win that game. And that's a Friday night game, so they're 2-0. Then they get UConn, 3-0. 4-0 after playing Middle Tennessee. Then they go and play at North Carolina. At home against North Carolina. That is where they take their first loss. So they're now 4-1. I think they lose 3 straight. So they're 4-3 because they lose to North Carolina, Georgia Tech, Florida State. Then they get back on the winning ledger and they beat SMU. So they're now 5-3. They lose to Miami 5-4. Beat North Carolina State 6-4. Lose to Virginia Tech 6-5 and beat Wake Forest 7-5. So Duke's record for me in 2024 is 7-5. Now we get to my potential conference winners, and the first one is North Carolina State. I can find it. North Carolina State. So North Carolina State, I like what they did in the portal. They bring in Grayson McCall from Coastal Carolina, and they got a couple receivers from the portal as well as a couple guys on defense. And I think overall they're going to have a really good season in 2024. Now, why don't we take a look at their schedule? They start the year at home against Western Carolina. That's going to be an easy win. Now, I've circled their week 2 game versus Tennessee. That is a big game on their schedule this year. And Tennessee's going to be one of the better teams in the SEC. As you've seen, if you haven't seen my SEC conference preview, I recommend going and watching that after this video. As you see where I have Tennessee, I think North Carolina State loses to Tennessee, so they're 1-1. But then they have another home game the next week, play Louisiana Tech. They'll beat Louisiana Tech, so they're 2-1. Then they get a game at Clemson. I think they lose to Clemson, so they're now 1-2. But then they get 2 easy games after that. They get Northern Illinois and Wake Forest. They're going to be 3-2 going into the Syracuse game. And I think they lose to Syracuse actually to drop to 4-3. And then they get Cal and Stanford, which I think they're going to lose to Cal. So that makes them 4-5. They beat Stanford 5-5. Beat Duke 6-5. beat Georgia Tech 7-5, and beat North Carolina 8-5. So I think North Carolina State gets 8-5 in 2024. My next potential conference winner for the ACC is Clemson. And Clemson, I don't know what my stance is on them. I think they're going to be good this year, but they could have another underwhelming year. And the elephant in the room here is their week 1 game against Georgia. I don't think they beat Georgia. So they start the year 0-1. Then they get App State. I think they beat App State. So they're 1-1. Now, that App State game could also end up being a loss because App State has the tendency to upset our bigger schools. But I do think Clemson beats them. So they're 1-1. Then they lose to North Carolina State, so they're 1-2. Beat Stanford 2-2. Lose to Florida State 2-3. Beat Wake Forest 3-4. Beat Virginia 4-4. Lose to Louisville 4-5. Lose to Virginia Tech 4-6. Beat Pitt 5-6. Beat Cincinnati 6-6. And beat South Carolina 7-6. So I think Clemson in 2024 goes 7-6. Next potential conference winner is Virginia Tech. And let's see, can I find? So Virginia Tech, they return a lot on offense and defense this year. And I think they're going to be one of the best teams in the ACC. Let's take a look at their schedule. Week 1, they play at Vanderbilt. That's going to be an easy win, so they're 1-0. Then they play Marshall week 2. I think they beat Marshall. So they're 2-0. Beat Old Dominion 3-0. Rutgers is going to be a really good team this year, but I don't think they have the firepower to beat Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech wins that game. Virginia Tech is now 4-0. So they're 4-0 going into the Miami game. That's where they take their first loss. So they're 4-1. But then they beat Stanford 4-2, 5-1. Lose to Boston, beat Boston College 6-1. Lose to Georgia Tech 6-2. I think they end up losing to Syracuse 6-3. Beat Clemson 7-3. Beat Duke 8-3, and beat Virginia 9-3. So I think Virginia Tech goes 9-3 in 2024. My next potential conference winner in the ACC is Miami, Florida. And Miami, Florida had 2 big additions in the transfer portal. One being Damian Martinez from Oregon State, and the other one being Cameron Ward from Washington State. But let's take a look at, and overall, I think Miami has the best chance. If not, and you'll hear my conference championship game in a few minutes. If not, the 2 teams I have in the conference championship game, I think Miami has the 3rd best odds, in my opinion, of making the conference championship game. But they start the year at Florida. I think they beat Florida. So they're 1-0. Then they play Florida A&M. That's going to be a win, so they're 2-0. Then they play Ball State, 3-0. Now, week 4, they could, and I'm going to say this truthfully, they could be looking ahead to that Virginia Tech game. This could be the South Florida game. It's at South Florida. It could be a trap game for Miami. They could be looking ahead a week to Virginia Tech. But I do think They beat South Florida. And you will see in a future video, I do think there might be upset potential for Miami against South Florida, but the other way around, being South Florida upsetting Miami. But in this video, I'm going to say Miami beats South Florida. So Miami is now 4-0. Then they play Virginia Tech at home. It's a night game at Hard Rock Stadium. I think they lose to Virginia Tech, so they're 4-1. Beat Cal 5-1. Lose to Louisville 5-2. I somehow think they will beat Florida State. So they're 6-2 now. Then they play Duke. I think they're gonna beat Duke. As I said when I did Duke's record prediction, I have Miami beating Duke. So there's 8-2. They lose to Georgia Tech 8-3, beat Wake Forest 9-3, and lose to Syracuse 9-4. So Miami's 2024 record prediction is 9-4, with the potential of a couple other losses being turned into wins. Maybe the Louisville game gets a win, and that makes them 10-3. Maybe they beat Syracuse to go 11-2. Same thing with all these potential conference winners I have for the ACC. There's a couple games where they could flip their record around. And my next potential conference winner in the ACC is Florida State. They start the year at Georgia. Well, they start the year with a game against Georgia Tech and that's week 0. I think they beat Georgia Tech. Oh, I missed Georgia Tech. We're going to do Georgia Tech after Florida State. So I think they beat Georgia Tech, so they're 1-0. Then they play Boston College. They will beat Boston College, so they're 2-0. Then they get Memphis. And I think that Memphis is going to be one of the better teams in the AAC. But I think Florida State beats them, so they're 4-0. Then they play Cal at home. They will beat Cal, so they're 5-0. Beat SMU 6-0. Lose to Clemson. No, lose to Clemson 6-1. Beat Duke 7-1. Lose to Miami. Beat Miami 6-2. No, 7-1. Beat North Carolina 8-1. Lose to Notre Dame 8-2. Beat Charleston Southern 9-2, and beat Florida 10-2. So I think Florida State's 2024 record prediction for me is 10-2. Now I missed a sleeper team in the ACC, and we're gonna put them in this. They were supposed to be in the sleeper category. I forgot, and it's Georgia Tech. And I like what Georgia Tech's got going for them. They start the year in Dublin against Florida State. Obviously, that's going to be a loss. Then they play Georgia State. I think they beat Georgia State, so they're 1-1. And then they play Syracuse. They lose to Syracuse, so they're 1-2. Then they play VMI. They beat VMI 2-2. Lose to Louisville 2-3. Beat Duke 3-3. Lose to North Carolina 3-4. Lose to Notre Dame 3-5. Beat Virginia Tech 4-5. Lose to Miami 4-6. Somehow I think they beat Georgia Tech, so they're 5-6. And do I think they beat Georgia? Maybe. I'm going to give them the one right now, but that could always be changed at some point. So they go 6-6. My last potential conference winner In the ACC, oh, wait, no. I completely forgot about it. Yeah, I completely forgot SMU. Let's do SMU. They're also a potential conference winner for me. They start the year at Nevada. I think they beat Nevada. They beat Houston Christian 2-0, beat BYU 3-0, beat TCU 4-0, lose to Florida State 4-1, lose to Louisville 4-2, beat Stanford 5-2, lose to Duke 5-3, beat Pitt 6-3, lose to Boston College 6-4, beat Virginia 7-4, and lose to Cal 7-5. So I think SMU's first year in the ACC, they go 7-5. Now let's get to Cal, and then we will get to the last potential conference winner in Louisville. So Cal, I like what I like what Coach Wilcox has done at Cal. Let's look at their schedule for their first year in the ACC. So they start the year at home against UC Davis. That's going to be a win. Then they go and play Auburn. I think they beat Auburn, so they're 2-0. Then they play at home against San Diego State the next week. That's a win, so they're 3-0. But then look at that mini 2-game gauntlet they got after San Diego State. Florida State on the road, Miami at home. I think they lose to Florida State, so they're 3-1. Then they lose to Miami 3-2, beat Pitt 4-2, lose to NC State 4-3, beat Oregon State 5-3, beat Wake Forest 6-3, lose to Syracuse 6-4, beat Stanford 7-4, and lose to SMU 7-5. No, beat SMU 7-5. So I think Cal's 2024 record for me is 7-5. And last but not least, we have oh no, we just did Miami. Whoops. I meant to click on Louisville. So Louisville, they start the year at home against Austin P. That's going to be a win, so they're 1-0. Then they play Jacksonville State. That's going to be a win, 2-0. Then they play Georgia Tech. I think they beat Georgia Tech 3-0. 4-0 after beating Notre Dame. 4-1 after losing to SMU. 5-1 after beating Virginia. 5-2 after losing to Miami. 6-2 after beating Boston College. 6-3 after losing to Clemson. 7-3 after beating Stanford. 8-3 after beating Pitt, and 9-3 after beating Kentucky. So I think Louisville in 2024 goes 9-3. And now my ACC conference championship game prediction is going to be for 2024 is Florida State and Virginia Tech. And I know what most people are going to say. I want to hear what y'all have to say in the comment section of this video. I do reply to comments. I want to hear your ACC predictions for the 2024 season. But my conference championship game is going to be between Florida State and Virginia Tech. And I think Virginia Tech ends up winning the ACC. And my top 3 finalists for Coach of the Year, number 3, Fran Brown at Syracuse. Number 2, Jeff Brom, Louisville. And number 1, Brett Pry at Virginia Tech. And when I do another Big Ten video, I will talk about the whole Michigan situation because I don't want to talk about it in this one because this is the ACC. But overall, my final thought.
Hold up.
Sorry about that. Little tech issues with my microphone. But overall, my thoughts on the ACC this year is I think the ACC is going to be a enjoyable conference to watch with a lot of games that are up in the air. And overall, it's the third best conference for me behind the Big 12 and the SEC, with the Big 10 being fourth. And I do have more videos coming out this week on college football. I have a couple more conference previews and some hot takes for the college football season for 2024. And that will wrap up. To make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. But that will wrap up today's video. I will see y'all with another video tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day.